We now have the pleasure of hearing from another literary master of our day, acclaimed for his memoirs, short stories, and novels, winner of the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Academy Award in Literature, the National Medal of Arts, and guys, I really could go on with the list of his awards.
Oh, go on.
Please welcome Tobias Wolff. You have been drawn to the themes of self-deception and truth-telling in your work. And why do you think that is?
It's always hard to give an account of why you're, obsessed with certain things, why your work takes the shape it does. I'm remembering a wonderful story about the great poet Robert Browning, who for some years had a correspondence with an invalid woman who eventually became his wife. And he went to visit her, Elizabeth Barrett, her name was, and they'd never actually met, but they'd corresponded, and their love actually revived her for many years. But she had first gotten in touch with him by writing letters about his work to him, and anyway, he visited her for the first time, and she said, Mr. Browning, as you know, I love your work. There's just one passage in one of your poems that's always puzzled me, and I'd love to hear what you intended by it. He said, let me see it. So she gave him the poem, and he read the passage, takes it over by the window, reads it again. He says, Madam, when I wrote that passage, only God and I knew what it meant, and now only God knows. So writers explaining their work is tricky. If they are actually explaining it, they're probably lying. But I will try. Deception was so much a feature of the family that I grew up in. My father was a very unhappy and divided and finally rather dishonest man, spent time in prison, and told a great many lies about himself. And there was a kind of fog of untruth, if you will, in the air in my family. I moved a lot when I was young. By the time I was 11 or 12, I moved 8 or 9 times. And that sounds like it can be something of a burden, but the truth is it gives you the chance. I mean, Americans, love to think of themselves as being able to reinvent themselves. I did it again and again and again. Everywhere I went, I had been a star basketball player at the last school I went, or the fastest runner. It does, the new place, the new people give you opportunities for self-invention that I did not neglect to take advantage of. And I became a little bit crooked, really, when I was young, and with predictable consequences, and thought a lot about it as I grew older, because it was that sort of tendency, as it had with my father, had really gotten in the way of my leading a good life and an adult life. So yes, it does show up in my work, that interest in deception, self-deception, and I don't think it is simply a personal problem for me. I think that cultures can become victims of self-deception. I believe our own has been. We tell ourselves myths about ourselves that keep us from realizing our true potential and let us off the hook. So these sorts of things that go on in individuals and families are seen really in whole communities of people. And So it is not just a personal or a parochial concern of mine.
Your writing style has been widely praised for a certain quality it possesses. We might call it its austerity, its stark, incisive portrayal of modern life. But there are a few minority reports, you have to dig a little bit to find them, that critique you along these lines as well, and that say that you kind of refuse to resolve conflicts in your work, and because of that, there's this sort of bleak effect that one could leave with and having read your stories. And so I was curious on finding that I wondered how you frame the function of the bleakness, or if you even identify with that.
I hope my stories are not bleak. For one thing, I have a certain sense of the absurdity of much of what we do that I hope comes into the work, not as cruel judgment, but as a shared laugh at ourselves. As to the question of how I leave readers, I really trust readers to be able to make connections for themselves without my forcing them to do so. So I might, in a short story, for example, tell enough of a life that I believe that the engaged reader will see how the rest of that arc will become a circle. That I'll bring them just far enough that they can, with their own imagination, emotional intelligence, and wisdom, be able to see where this story goes without it being completely resolved for the reader. It's a form of trust and, in a sense, collaboration with the reader that I value in the writers that I love. I like it that they don't tell me more than they need to tell me for me to have understanding. So I participate in the creative act of the story.
We're about out of time, but you wrote a piece for The New Yorker called Winter's Light, where you tell a story from your own life about an experience that was nearly an epiphany of faith, to use a loaded term, but something turned you away from it. And then you go on to say that eventually it was poetry that drew you back to the possibility of faith. And I wonder if you could just finish up here by telling us what you meant by that, and perhaps sharing a poem or a set of verses that you return to in that regard.
Well, yes, it was a strange night with a friend of mine when both of us, in different ways, found ourselves drawn to an experience of faith, and then something happened that he was able to go on, and I really turned away from it because of a kind of mawkish sentimentality that I saw in what was going on. But it was my reading really began to wake me up again to that possibility. The poetry of George Herbert, 400 years ago, he still talks to me in some ways. He has a poem that I love called "The Collar," and he was a clergyman, so he had a collar, and he also meant the collar that like you put on a dog and that restrains you. And he's also talking about collar like anger, choleric. And in this poem, he is fighting the constraints of the life that his faith has put him in. That he's stuck in this little village. He feels kind of almost jailed in. He wants to get going. He wants to move out into the world and get away from all this. And he feels like he's drying up. And as he's getting toward the end of this angry address to God, and he says, and as I grew more fierce and wild with every word, methought I heard one calling, "Child, And I replied, my Lord. That poem still blooms in me. And, you know, I have children, and it's funny when one of the boys might be doing something that I wanted to call his attention to, I would say, son, son. And that would, in a way, call him to order, restore him to a sense of himself, a sense of my loving authority. And the same way in which he hears that voice say, child, and that sense of care that comes out of that, and calling him back. There's a line in one of Eliot's, a passage in one of Eliot's poems in the Four Quartets that reminds me a little of that too, and has had the same effect on me. It goes, the whole earth is our hospital, endowed by the ruined millionaire, wherein, if we do well, we shall die of the absolute paternal care that will not leave us and prevents us everywhere. Right? It comes, I mean, think of that psalm. Thou hast beset me behind and before and laid thine hand upon me. That sense of being in some way guided against our will often, but with that sense of a hand, a guiding hand. How that comes through, I don't know in why that should speak to me so directly and influence me and not another person. Who knows, but that was the effect on me.
Thank you very much. Please thank you, Tobias Wolff, everyone.